All right, happy Tuesday, March 19th, everyone, and welcome to our monthly jobs report and inflation update with Dr. Riley White. Dr. Riley White is the Associate Professor of Finance at the University of New Mexico and joins us every month to talk about the state of the economy, answer our concerns and questions about where the job market is headed, and give us the trends and data you need to know as you pursue your career goals. You're invited to ask questions at any given point in time. Put your comments in the webinar chat box, or if you're watching on Facebook, in the Facebook comment box, and share anything that you might be seeing as well. And as always, the recording for this webinar will go up about 24 to 36 hours after its recording, to which where you can watch it in perpetuity. Um, Without further ado, Dr. White, welcome back as always. I love giving that introduction, and you can also Google or look up Dr. Riley White on LinkedIn for all of his credentials, which are amazing. And I'll let him take it away from here. Thank you so
Oh, thank you so
much.
much, Albert. Thank you, Colin, and thank you, the Albert's List community. It is such a thrill every month to be with you all and explain a little bit about the economic situation. I'm so glad to be here today. I also want to note a few things, as Albert noted. Please ask me whatever question that floats into your mind about anything. No such thing as a dumb question. There's questions from all angles. I don't know the answer to every question, but at least if there's an economic perspective on it, I'm happy to give it, as well as some of our outstanding hosts today. And Colin has wonderful insights, and Albert has wonderful insights as well. And so some things as we get into this shenanigan infused adventure series today. Although it is March, our February jobs report uses data from last month, which is the most recent data available. So this is what we're talking about. And we're going to go over a few things today and a few nature of the economy. We received some questions beforehand. I am thrilled to answer. So I got a whole list of some exceptionally interestingly challenging questions. I'll gear some presentation questions toward them. If I missed your question for whatever reason or something else happens, never hesitate to ask in the chat window. Some things are happening. We've gotten an economic situation that is overall good, but it doesn't feel good. So we'll explain why that might be. And we'll go over a few other things too that I think you'll find relevant. Colin had some great suggestions about going over the reserve requirements in banks and why that was 0%, and also some other stuff about the economy. So we're doing a little bit on climate impacts of the economy, doing a little bit across the board, all kinds of things that floated through the window today that I just grabbed and threw down slides on the presentation that hopefully makes some sense to you all today. So let's do it. My name is Riley White, Associate Professor of Finance. Everything, of course, in this picture, AI generated. Fascinating discourse to look at, especially considering is the economy hot or cold? Who knows? And why does jobs have an apostrophe before the S, implying some type of ownership? Who knows? But it's obviously the best AI can put together at this moment sometimes. So let's talk about the jobs report that happened last month first. Let's kick it off with some shenanigans. It was good, but it wasn't great. We added about 275,000 new jobs. We'll explain if this number is a good number or bad number, actually, because there's a big unknown in this marketplace, and that is immigration. And a recent study from the Economic Policy Institute suggested that about 50% of the job growth we've seen in the last year is immigration based, or the economic impact we've seen has been immigration based. And that's both legal and illegal immigrants that have come into the country. And as a consequence, because that's hard to measure, it's very difficult to determine if this number is actually a good number. So if in a high immigration environment, this number would be kind of okay, not stellar by any means. In a low immigration environment, like kind of after 2017, 2018, 2019, when immigration dropped off significantly, this would actually be a really good number. And so one of the reasons there's been this departure of situations of how many jobs makes the economy hum along is this discrepancy in data that we're seeing that's driven in part by an understanding of immigration that is very much incomplete. Oh yes, please, Albert. As Albert points out, I'm available on LinkedIn. You can find me there. Other things. I won't spam your feed with anything. But good to contact, and always welcome to reach out with other questions as they pertain to anything that you're interested in talking about. So anyway, so we had 275,000 jobs, but unemployment rose to 3.9%. 3.9%. Now that is, again, when we think about the unemployment rate across the country, anything below 5 is okay. 3 to 4%, where it's been lingering over the last year and a half, very close to what we call full employment. But it is rising, and that's important to note. In fact, the number of unemployed people rose about 334,000. And it feels like it's all in the Bay Area, but not always. But there's some reasons for that. The number of unemployed people, when we measure things like economic data, we're measuring both people who have jobs and people who are looking for jobs. And so right now, to be counted in that unemployment rate, you are part or actively looking for a job, or you have a job. If you've dropped out of the workforce, you're not part of that unemployment rate. So when we did add jobs, where did we add it? And this is a bit like a broken record. It was a lot in healthcare, about 67,000. The margins are good. The profitability is good. People are getting older. Healthcare, a solution to everyone's problem, but without a solution. 52,000 were added in the government and about 42,000 in eating and drinking establishments, pulling back continuous growth that we've seen since the COVID-19 pandemic, the center of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw leisure and hospitality employment drop off substantially. Labor force participation, that's the percent of people who could be working that are either looking for a job or have a job. And it actually remains steady at about 62.5%. Some notes on this: our participation rate in the labor force, people who are part of the labor force and not out of it because they've retired or they dropped out, or one spouse works and another doesn't work, for instance. That's if a spouse drops out of the labor force for childcare purposes, they leave that perspective. But the United States demographically is getting older. And as a consequence, we reached our maximum amount of workforce participation back in the year 2000, in the middle when baby boomers were in prime working age. And every recession since then, it's dropped off without recovering. And so it's a fascinating question to look at today. Albert says, oh, look at all these things. Colin says, how do the numbers work? Where 275,000 jobs are added, but 334,000 people become unemployed, more unemployed people. So Colin, to that question, it won't be an exact change. What we're looking at is two separate numbers that evaluate certain things. We add an aggregate 275,000 more jobs, but to be counted among the unemployed, you could be looking for work. And so some of that is people who might be coming back into the workforce as well, which of course will change that number a little bit. So that's an interesting question. So it won't be an even thing. They're just focused on two different pieces of information. Albert said, what I noted about the jobs are they're added in government and healthcare. One doesn't generate revenue and the other is very inelastic and regulated. True. Is it safe to conclude that the government is keeping our economy going? The government's a big part of keeping our economy going, for sure. And especially when it comes down to this, since the $5 trillion stimulus package that got us out of the doldrums of COVID-19, the government has been highly infused into day to day. But government employment in particular has been particularly robust as of late, despite the fact that in many cases, a lot of government labor does lag behind private sector work in a lot of places, but it also indicates that there have been longstanding shortages in the government sectors that haven't been met with the population as a whole. A good example being among municipalities, cities and towns, education, teachers, stuff like this that might be counted in other ways. Very interesting question. Aaron says, when you get to 3 to 4% employment, it really means only 2% real employment. 2% real employment. That's true too. I mean, this is a very good value overall. Albert says, if government employment is keeping everything from collapsing, is it safe to conclude that our economy is not doing well in the first place? But no, the government itself is only one part of the overall puzzle. We are dynamic in other parts of the labor force, but it's inconsistent across industries, and we have substantial weaknesses as well, as we note. Another thing, is the economy getting stronger or weaker? We are weakening. Another symptom of that is that wage growth is slowing down to about 0.2%. That's about 2.9% per annum. And when we look at hires, quits, and layoff rates up till 2024, we notice that those hiring levels, after reaching that post-COVID peak, are now back down to where they were around 2015 or so. And they're continuing to drop. So firms are hiring less. Workers are less confident about the job market and they're quitting their jobs less, meaning less availability of jobs. But the number of layoffs, although they're concentrated in higher levels across the West, than other parts of the country due to the tech sector in particular. But they are not higher, significantly worse than what we've seen beforehand. Overall, we look like we're on a trajectory to hit a soft landing, and we'll see what happens with that. Aaron points out the beta delta of personal plans. Oh man, this is excellent. Is the change in the numbers, i.e. people retire, drop out of employment, go to college and trade school. Absolutely right. Encore says, how stable is the federal public sector? One only reason I left back in 2013 is because of a shutdown, which would have led me to getting evicted had I not taken another gig. Obviously, the specter of government shutdowns is a question when it comes down to employment and where people choose to work. Overall, federal employment has been robust. Let me grab a chart for you right now, because that's a really good one. Let's do some real finance here. Well, let's get some. I'll get the federal side because that's a good thing to separate federal and local. The thing with federal employment, though, when we look at an aggregates, it's still about the same level we've seen since about 1990 in terms of the physical size of the federal employment. And I'll show you exactly what that looks like. So it's consistent, but it's not itself necessarily a growing sector in itself. We see a lot more activity in state and local when it comes down to government issues. And here I'll copy paste. Here's all federal employees, Ankur. To give you a sense for this, take a look all the way back in time. So apart from the buildup in wartime, the 1940s, and then it dropped off again, Cold War, we saw a lot more increase in government employment. Federal employees in general, we look at just about 2.9 million. Across the board, we have these little spikes at times, driven by certain economic conditions and certain issues at play. But the long-term trend has been remarkably stable, actually going back even further to about 1970. So what a time. So gradually somebody retires and you can finally take their position as a fiscal government analyst for, based on the churn I've seen in some federal institutions in New Mexico, where I live. Aaron says 80% of government employment is state and local. Also correct. And that's where we're seeing a lot of these higher backs to that point. So that's absolutely true. Albert says, I noticed the government employment seemed to increase during the Reagan administration. Wasn't he all for reducing its size? That's the great mythos. He did increase, of course. And indeed, I think his whole strategy in outspending the government of the Soviet Union led to a lot of increases in federal spending, federal employment, other things. Fascinating government. What one says and what one does, not always the same thing. Anonymous attendee asked a question. Given currently relatively high interest rates, I get the impression that companies are reluctant to hire new employees, like a recent graduate like myself. Whenever the Fed decrease interest rates, can we expect to see a bit more hirings? In short, yes. One thing that would put the accelerator on the economy is if the Fed were to drop interest rates. So when the Fed, and this is a good question for everybody, controls one interest rate, overnight lending to large banks. But why do we care about it so much? It's a ripple effect on every other interest rate in the economy. When the economy has a high level of inflation, money is sloshing around, and prices are increasing, the Fed wants to reduce the supply of money. It wants to reduce the amount of investment that's happening, the amount of ways that money is being spent. So it makes money more expensive. When money gets more expensive, a lot of things get more expensive to issue. That company I want to buy, or maybe that factory I want to build, all of that suddenly, that was a good deal when interest rates were low, is a good deal no longer. And as a consequence, when interest rates are low and the economy's humming along and the Fed wants to stimulate economy, they want to stimulate hiring when the interest rates are low, because that means that a lot of projects become feasible. To fund these projects from construction to employment, the firms start hiring in mass, and it can get us out of a recession. On the opposite side, when we raise those rates like we've done, it does consolidate, it does constrict investment, it does reduce hiring, and it does weaken the economy. But it controls inflation, which of course is the specter that Jerome Powell is trying to control for. And so when we look to the rate increase, decrease, as long as the rates remain higher long time, expect the job market to kind of tighten as it has been gradually. But when we look at this on the other side, if the Fed were to lower rates, that would stimulate some economic activity. And this is the question right now, fundamentally, is do we want to lower rates now and preemptively jumpstart the economy into a period of growth? Or would it jumpstart inflation again if we did so? And Jerome Powell is very much afraid of this. So that's why he's keeping interest rates high. He wants to keep inflation low until it's very convincingly low over a long period of time. And he's still concerned about a few issues in inflation, and that's why he's hesitating on making any cuts immediately. Although back in December, he committed to having 3 cuts so far. Aaron says, objectively, Reagan was the most FDR Keynesian since FDR. That's probably true. Actually, that's very astute, Aaron. That's great. Albert says inflation was transitory anyway, so we should lower the rates before it breaks. Always true. The Fed raises rates historically until something breaks, is the old adage. So let's talk real talk here. So this is a question, you've seen it, you've done it, you live in this environment. You're asking yourself and saying, okay, Riley, this data looks good. I hear you on unemployment. Oh, the economy's doing great. I don't feel like it's great. None of my friends think it's great. What's going on here? And some of this dates back, of course, to the question of the tech layoffs we've seen over the last couple of years. Overall, a lot of reasons for this. Biggest, of course, is that tech overcompensated during COVID-19, hired more people than it needed and got rid of them. That's some of the story. The other thing is that, of course, interest rates are high now, investment costs are high. That means that growth trajectory that made sense a few years back no longer makes sense today. And as a consequence, these reduced expectations have resulted in firms trimming and being a lot more careful with the money and operations that they have. But we look over time, and this is hard to read if you're in the cheap seats or sitting there with on a phone or some kind of maybe a computer device from the late 80s and just trying to ascertain what these numbers say. But this is from, of course, layoffs.fyi, January 2022 to March 2024. The blue number is the number of companies with layoffs, which is on the right-hand side, key, and on the left-hand side, the number of employees that have been laid off. And so we're a far cry from where we were a year ago when we were talking about huge amounts of unemployed layoffs happening, every major firm, tech firm issuing layoffs, up to 90,000 layoffs in a given month, as we saw in January. However, since that time period, except for a bit of an increase that we saw in January, it has been relatively low. I do think, and one question that I had was, are these tech layoffs going to end? We are over the hump with regards to layoffs, and I suspect that right now it'll be about stability for these firms and hiring back as they retool and look at different sectors. On the other side, when you look at tech layoffs since COVID-19 in general, in another sense, we saw significant layoffs in 2020 with the rest of COVID. It was worse post-COVID for tech. Since that time, it has gotten better, but layoffs remain a little bit elevated. And that's actually an interesting point, because right now, it is certainly not good, but we're still seeing firms continue to trim, continue to reevaluate, and continue to do certain things that are an effort in an effort to improve their economic forecast, economic potential in the future. So I suspect that into 2024, we're going to see higher than average levels of. One question that I had, is it going to continue in 2024? I suspect it will continue as these economic adjustments and shifts in business strategies occur. Once some of this happens, tech focus on automation, AI, remote work infrastructure may help rebound and drive high in the future, particularly if rates drop. So this is a difficult period, but it's likely a transitory one as it pertains to tech. And that's the kind of good news about this. One person asked, where do you think the future job additions will be? You know, and this as well, and this is specific. Some people are looking specifically into the tech question. Other people are like, well, you know, maybe it's something else in this. So in the next 3 months or so in particular, which is the question, where do I suspect there'll be additions to future of job additions? I think the government sector will remain relatively strong. I think renewable energy, technology, especially cybersecurity and cloud services, will bounce back, continue to see growth there. Healthcare, of course, is going to continue to be robust for no other reason than it remains incredibly expensive and profitable to be in healthcare in the United States. The exact timeline, I think, in recovery and the expansion of various sectors depends on things like economic policies, advancements, market demand. But I think right now, healthcare, cybersecurity, things like renewable energy, because of the investment that needs to happen there, are places where you'll see continued growth. And that's an interesting question. Aaron's got some great data. Powell should finish crushing inflation, construction services price levels. another year, wait till unemployment shifts to 4.5 and 5 and start cutting the discount rate. I think that's, Aaron, that's possibly what his plan might be in some sense. Wait for the unemployment rate to hit a trigger number, maybe 4.5 or 5, before he cuts. But I don't know if that'll happen or not. Our hope is that unemployment remains low, but it is rising. Juicero. Colin's $10 billion business idea right there. You've heard it here first. You'll be hiring employees soon. Aaron says one reason tech layoffs are high is that we have thousands of zombie unicorns, no, serpicorns that VC's pumped trillions into that are now basically worthless and will all go through this issue. That is true, of course, in some sense. I think we've got overvaluation is a product of overexuberance. And overexuberance and overexcitement in ways that we don't understand a technology or we think a technology will do well. All of this will contribute to this. So Aaron brings up some very timely and relevant points for this as well. So this is good, really good questions that you guys are asking too, and this is solid. So let's go back a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the information sector. So how did the layoffs pan out for the information sector recently? Going back to sort of overall employment information is actually lower now than it was before, of course, the 2008. I know this key is a little bit messed up here, but this is the Great Recession here, followed by the COVID-19 recession. So all the way in the mid 2000s, we had a higher number of people working in the information sector. And the 2008 Great Recession happened. A lot of people were laid off and they were hired back very, very slowly. COVID-19 came around that resulted in more layoffs that surged back, but then we lost a little bit through the layoffs that we've seen. And as a consequence, in the information sector right now, we're still struggling, but we are matching more or less the trend line over the long run. And so I suspect slow and steady growth will be the name of the game of the information sector once we level off a bit and once we continue to see potentially some rates going down. That's great. Colin says, Juicero plus AI. Colin has refined his business strategy before you know you need it. That's going to be excellent. That sounds very suspicious. Oh, great. So where did we see these layouts back in? Colin, yes, explain your business. Yeah, before we get into
I mean, I'm just seeing a lot of AI being shoehorned into so many industries and projects and startup ideas, and there's going to be a reckoning for that. There will be an insane reckoning because like the audience doesn't, half the consumer base doesn't understand what AI is. They think it might just be a behavior detection system, which is not AI. And there's an actual definition for what is truly machine learning, and there's a definition for what is artificial intelligence. And the marketing gimmick is just, yeah, I just see it as a time bomb waiting to happen. It's absolutely dangerous to see what the market is trying to do with it. And the VCs don't understand what they're looking at half the time.
So Colin, go on. What do you think will happen if you made a projection on how the AI industry will grow in the next few years, or the bubble is here, to Albert's point? What do you think? So how is this going to pan out as you see it from the tech side?
So
I have a lot of thoughts on this one too.
Yeah,
but go first, Colin.
Like genuine machine learning and AI is unbelievably hard to accomplish and requires millions of dollars of algorithms plus hardware. The hardware alone is costly, right? And you also need data training sets. And basically you have to be around FANG level to even accomplish that. And what they're trying to do with that has its purpose. You know, I do see the value in what ChatGPT has done. Obviously, it's destroyed a lot of, learning institutions. And I've seen code and infrastructure as code pushed out from AI, which it's extremely infantile, but like the technology is technically less than 4 years old. So I've said it before, like last year, is like it's going to come faster than you expect, but slower than you want it. And I still stand by that statement, right? NVIDIA, obviously, good call out. NVIDIA and AMD will make buttloads of money because during the gold rush, you want to sell shovels, right? And everybody is basically limited to buying from NVIDIA or AMD. But like the application of what they're trying to do, a lot of it doesn't make sense. There's always going to be the next exercise app. There's always going to be the next weight loss, whatever scam. There's also always going to be the next, you know, stock prediction or whatever with AI. But like, is that true? And if it really was, why would you even share that? Right? And there's just so many problems with what the disconnect between people who don't actually understand what AI is and what its advantages are versus those that do. And like we're like let's use a concrete example to bring it to Albert's list. A lot of people worry that their jobs are at risk because of AI. Honestly, that tells me you weren't good at your job in the first place if you could be replaced by AI. I'm going to be very honest. The people who are going to keep their jobs are going to be people who can adapt AI into their workflow. I'm a writer like 99% of the time for my work. You would think I could be replaced by ChatGPT. It cannot. My boss has thought about it and read my work and read ChatGPT generated stuff and is just like, he knows ChatGPT cannot replace me because ChatGPT is the best and worst of everything it's been trained on. And all I have to do is be better than average. That's literally it. You have to just be better than average because AI is just average. That's it.
And if you're not better than average, be a finance professor, because that's where we'll go.
The
I
whole
mean,
if you
Have a
can't
career.
do, then you teach, and if you can't teach, then you know, teach PE, I suppose.
That's
you
right.
just have to be better than
You
average.
can't teach or do anything. You go to Albert's list and do the economic commentary. But one of the things that this is, so to your point, Colin, this is actually an interesting discussion, and I appreciate you taking the time to make that distinction characteristic on AI. We were just having a conversation. So I write with my co-author a lot on innovation topics. So we write a slew of papers that deal with financial innovation and regular innovation and other stuff. And so the way we were talking about it was, or the way that I think about AI in my end is that imagine, it's 150 years ago and you're working in the Industrial Revolution and you're actually maybe it's 200 years ago, maybe it's earlier, maybe it's pre-Luddite, and you're going in there and you're sewing, pockets on trousers, and that's your job. You get through, 20 of these in the course of a day, and that's good business because they're thorough and that's how much the cost goes. Somebody gives you a sewing machine, that's AI. From that point, you can now mint 100 of these pairs of pants in a given hour. That increases your productivity, makes you a better worker doing the stuff that you can control, which leads the question of what can we do with AI as an industry? Is it a threat? Or can we train people better to handle AI, to manage AI, to use it as a supplement to the existence that you have? We're working on that right now. I wrote a policy for our school about AI that kind of asks that very question. So it's a topic of relevancy. So I love it, Colin. So you're right. That's a good perspective.
What I
I
want to
can
say though, oh, sorry, go ahead. You have final thoughts?
I can only speak like for writing, and people think that's the first thing that's going to be replaced because they've seen ChatGPT work. But like the final function that really makes or breaks the end result of anything is whether or not critical thought was put into it. And you can't become good at writing if you don't have a good sense of what is good or not. And so students will turn in ChatGPT stuff, and because of their level of taste, I guess, for what is good writing is at their level, they think it's good, but it's not. Like anybody who understands reading to a certain level can read AI stuff and be like, oh, well, this is attempting to be good, but it's not actually good. And I can say why. And that's actually how I'm teaching my students right now. Like I tell them, hey, here's the topic, generate it with ChatGPT and critique what it comes out. Because that's the actual skill you need to develop. That's the fundamental skill that cannot be replaced. You need to be able to critically think about the result of what's coming out because it cannot critically think about what makes for good writing. It's just doing what it's been trained to do, which is ingest a bunch of writing samples and then spit out what it thinks is an average of all those writing samples. So it's average. So you have to be able to say, okay, this is bad because it did this, or it started a sentence like this because it did this, or this sentence doesn't follow the previous sentence, which is a complete like misunderstanding of what's going on. And I don't think AI can ever replace that because then if we got to that, we would have general purpose AI, which is a completely different beast. And general purpose AI, I don't think I'm qualified to speak on, but I do believe at that point, when you have general purpose AI, then we might have the sky is falling conversation because at that point, the AI has demonstrated it can critically think at the level of a human, which is very, very different than what we have right now. We're not even close. We are just at machine learning models spitting out the average of everything that's been fed. So anyways, that's it. Albert, you were saying?
I'm actually typing in my answer. So what I want to say is that I was making the Uber Lyft comparison where Uber and Lyft were subsidized by venture capital in the mid 2010s, but once they exited into the public market, that lack of VC money meant that Uber and Lyft had to raise their prices to where the cost of a taxi versus the cost of an Uber and a Lyft was very negligible, right? When you're trying to get out of an airport and the cost of a taxi versus an Uber and a Lyft is just $5 difference, it doesn't really matter what you take at that point. Sometimes you just take the taxi because you take the taxi. So the thing that I want to make with regards to AI here is that AI is being heavily subsidized by venture capital right now as well. And so the accountant then or writer that you're replacing at 45 bucks an hour for $12 an hour in a chatbot is a cheap thing to do right now because it's easy to do and the energy is being subsidized, the resources are being subsidized. But what happens when the hard questions get asked and the companies that are investing in this AI and building these AI solutions or relying on expensive resources have to do something. And so in that regard, we're gonna come here in the next 5 years with a question of do we keep the lights on and the electricity on for our citizens in our town, or do we direct all of that electric power to an artificial intelligence system? Or do we believe that it's okay now that technology companies can invest in nuclear power and we entrust a nuclear power plant somewhere in California to Facebook, another one to Google, and another one to Microsoft and hope that things work out? And then at that point, all of a sudden, the accountant or the writer that was replaced at $45 for a $12 AI bot becomes a $70 an hour expense. And then you're going to go back to human labor because you realize that paying a human plus benefits um, is cheaper than the AI. However, I think one thing to note is that because AI works a lot faster, maybe instead of keeping that AI bot on 24 hours a day, you only keep it on for 6 hours of the day, and that brings it back down to its $12 an hour cost as opposed to the $70 an hour cost, which means that you end up being able to dictate when your labor is on and off. And it's still cheaper, but overall, you just can't keep the technology on all the time because, as we're seeing similarly with cloud computing right now, cloud computing use cases are really highly dependent on what you're doing it with. And there's this whole notion that you can't be in cloud computing for some use cases because it's actually more expensive than being on premises. And so, if you look beyond the hype and look into the reality, there are hidden costs, uncertain costs that you have to account for. And until you do that, you cannot come out and really truly say that AI is the silver bullet that we all think it is, because when you look at the financial numbers, there's a lot more to be considered. So those are just my 2 cents.
Wow, good insight, Colin and Albert. I appreciate you both so much. One thing about AI, what I love about AI the most personally, that if the provost asks me a technical question, I can respond to him and ask AI to pretend they're a pirate, and it becomes very amusing for me when I send emails with a certain guys. But apart from like the amusement that AI can provide, or the potential damage that AI can provide, or some of the both, or some of both categories, I am not particularly worried about the investment market, the hiring market, the how AI will replace a great deal of jobs for the reasons specified here involving its limitations, but also, of course, in the long run, remember that it's not technology which is itself necessarily always always what breaks down barriers. It takes humanity because of everything, all the frictions we have, the establishments, the committees, the issues, the companies. It takes us years from when a technology is introduced to when it actually becomes widely used and widely has replaced a job. Good example, telephone operators. We solved the telephone operator question back in the 1920s. We were still hiring telephone operators as late as the mid-80s. So it takes often multiple generations before something that a task that should be eliminated based on some new technology is effectively so. And what happens is the economy evolves, other jobs form. And training to provide people adequate ability to take those jobs becomes fundamentally important. Love the conversation here as well. Love the technical conversation, especially involving the nature of IBM mainframes and all of that stuff. So going back, going to shift gears a little bit because I got some stuff I got to cover on the layoffs of industries here. Industries that were hit hardest: e-commerce, social media, enterprise software, fintech, across the board. And so I suspect that a lot of these are cashed through the system, not looking at greater increases in the next few months about layoffs, but it also is going to be, it's going to be an interesting ride. So short-term job growth outlook was one question I had. Riley, what do you think is going to happen? So soft landing in the economy right now, hopefully. Slight increase in unemployment to 3.9%. Slowdown in wage growth, easing inflation pressures in the long run, even though inflation is choppy. Construction sector, strong growth due to high demand for skilled workers and significant federal funding. High interest rates and labor shortages are challenging rapid expansion, but immigration is helping some of this. And that's why we've seen construction be relatively robust. Utilities, steady hiring is anticipated because utilities are expected to generate huge amounts of infrastructure bets, especially in some states like New Mexico, like other states across the country that have targets for renewable energy. Growth in solar, geothermal, wind power generation, all that infrastructure costs. It's all about energy, and it's all about energy abundance. And we want an abundance of clean energy, an abundance of energy, an abundance of everything we need to power AI and all the related growth. Financing material costs are going to be challenges. Conventional energy sources are likely going to continue to be around in the short term. Life sciences, healthcare industry faces worker shortages, remains resilient because it makes so much money, and it's 15% of our GDP. Pharmaceutical industry is struggling with reduced demand for COVID-19, but there's gene therapies, other areas we'll continue to see growth in. Transportation as well. Automotive industry is going to see fluctuating employment levels due to the aftermath of last year's strike and a slowdown in electric vehicle demand, but aerospace and defense look for steady gains as well. And I think we're going to see continued government spending in these areas, regardless of whatever the presidential election happens. Professional services, automation, business priorities, changing nature of work. People are asking, why are professional services so flat? All of these reasons. Companies are reevaluating their service models and where they're putting money to invest in. That leads to cautious hiring. So all this stuff put together are big parts of this. So this is a really, really interesting question. So Albert asked me, I saw the other day that analysts are starting to see a no landing scenario. Are your peers talking about this? Or is this not a concern? No landing. It depends what you mean. So it depends how you define no landing in an economy. So done by this way, if you're looking at above trend growth and above trend inflation, so I would argue that we're not even seeing that now. I think no landing is a fascinatingly optimistic approach, but again, so here's the reasons why a no landing scenario isn't the case right now. That implies we're not. So in my head, that implies we're not going down. A soft landing implies we won't be in a recession. We'll weaken like we're doing now, but then we'll recover. And of course, a hard landing means we enter a recession. Now, a no landing situation at that point, we're seeing decline in credit quality. We're seeing decline in jobs. We're seeing greater unemployment. This is a landing. It's a soft one, but it certainly isn't no landing. So I'm going to punt that football over to the moon for people who just don't want to look at numbers or data or values. So I don't agree with it. So I think right now that we do have, we're looking for a soft landing, but a no landing idea, I think, is not something that I'm putting a heavy stake in. And a soft landing is good. It still means the economy is growing, the economy is positive, and things are good. It's just slowing down somewhat, and it is slowing down somewhat. Monthly business applications, though, and here's the other thing. Now, if you look at another angle and you say, Riley, monthly business applications are really high. So one thing about the dynamism of the U.S. economy is that we've seen business applications, which shot up during COVID, continue to be strong, although they pulled off some of their highs they saw earlier last year. But some of those, and a high number of what's called high propensity applications, these are businesses that go on to hire people or come from a corporate entity or provide some planned wages and have a specific NIAX industry code with them. These ones are actually those high potential businesses. We're seeing the generations of this remain 50% higher than the benchmark we had for all the years prior to 2020. Businesses are indeed failing, but businesses are rising again from the ashes. And that's very optimistic. This is really interesting. Sean says it's a Boeing landing where the landing gear falls off into the San Francisco SFO parking lot. And maybe the door flies off mid-flight. Sorry, folks, no landing here. We're just going to continue to fly and hope that we never run out of fuel. Good job, Sean. Colin says the actual problem isn't that it'll be exceptionally good, but more quality to cost of production ratio. Oh, that's very good. AI and AI only needs 500 hours of training cycles to produce something that might be 80% as good 1% of the time. That's solid. The friendly skies. How are we going to land this thing? The door's blowing off, but we're landing, and that's good. Other things, quits are signaling a further slowing in wage growth. Slowing in wages is encouraging when we think about inflation growth dropping. It isn't encouraging when you say, I would like to make more money to accommodate my lifestyle that I'm trying to live. But right now, we've actually seen the quit rate drop, and with that, ECI private sector wages and salaries, year-on-year percentages are continuing to fall. So we're seeing that this is a very much a slowing economy, and it will get to a point, I think, that will be in the next few months that will tell whether or not we actually do worse or not. Now, population increases. This is the issue I was talking to you about immigration and why economists in general have vast discrepancies in the way they handle the question of immigration in the data. By its nature, we only have a rough estimate of the amount of illegal immigration that might happen. We know the numbers that the government can provide on legal immigration, but we have a whole bunch of immigrants that come from other places because it's a very, of course, tedious process to go through the immigration system in a traditional way. But as a consequence, one issue that we have is when we look at economic data and try to determine if we're doing well or not, we don't know because there's we either added 4 million people last year, or maybe we added 1.5 million people last year. And depending on what story we tell, that tells us if the job market growth we've seen has been good or not so good in this situation, or more typical of what we've seen. I suspect that immigration, I believe the Economic Policy Institute's analysis, from what I've seen, that about 50% of the job growth we've seen last year, driven in part by the increase in immigration that we've seen. The priority for the country, of course, should be to figure out ways to streamline the legal immigration process as a source of growth in the long run. Now, February inflation story. Inflation rose a little bit to 0.4%, 3.2% annually, still a little toasty for Jerome Powell. So he's likely going to keep this higher in the long run. It's still up a little bit. Energy costs were actually interesting. They dropped a little bit. That worked against inflation. We saw continued increases in all items, continued increase in some of those service items that are one of the things that Jerome Powell is particularly concerned about. Food, on the other hand, varied. Food at home, we're only up about 1% annually. Food away from home, all those restaurant food, we're looking at 5.5% over where we were last year. So that's where we're seeing a lot of inflation right now. Yeah, Aaron says general consensus 3 to 4 million people come into the US each year. The problem is that doesn't match the numbers that we have from official immigration statistics, but we do know that some of the labor force, the labor issues that we have a lot of jobs that are not currently filled. And so the fact they are starting to be filled begs the question of, the nature of this and the nature of how that's going through the system. Immigration, of course, very good in aggregate for the economy. It does have interesting effects. It doesn't completely. This is a common fear people have in general when addressing the immigration issue is that it's coming for, their jobs individually. That's usually not the case. One issue with finance and economics in general is we view things in aggregates and not the individual stories that are behind them. There was a paper that came out fairly recently that looked at the workers most susceptible to immigration were low-income workers themselves in the United States. And as a consequence, those workers, or especially workers doing non-technical work, service sector work, in places where they may have maintained a job, might have difficulty maintaining their level of living standard and wages because of an addition of immigration. So it does increase competitiveness in the economy. If I were to wave a hand and make the system better, I would make a very robust legal immigration model that was able to admit workers depending on where we possess shortages in a given economic cycle, and provide a lot of resources for those people as they get in. And right now it is very hard. It is very labyrinthian. And any professor will tell you we all have students and grad students who have difficulty getting visas and go through extensive hoops in that process to do so, despite the fact we have so many well-qualified people with an interest in living in this country. So it's a wonderful thing, and it's something to think about in the long run. It does benefit job growth, and it does benefit demographics growth, and it does benefit the economic growth in the long run. Michael says, too bad prices continue to rise. as the two items people are most aware of are food and gasoline. Indeed, food and gasoline, lunch of champions. Aaron De Los Reyes says the real trade-off nobody wants to talk about is that most immigration competes for low-wage jobs, which depresses low-wage jobs in poor Americans. On the aside, though, the question for the economy as a whole is yes, and that's what the paper pointed out. But at the same time, it said, well, how can we train, and what are the actual advantages that we can provide that will get people into a situation where they can be competitive in other sectors of the economy? And so it is a complex question and one worth discussing and answering in all accounts. We've got a Colin when Colin's unmuted and he's got his screen approached. The Colin is ready to attack. Colin, what do you got?
I don't know about attack, but if inflation is rising again, will the Fed commit to lowering rates?
Not as soon as we want them to. So the downside is if inflation continues to be iffy like this, the Fed will say, wait a second, I'm going to hold off on these rate cuts. Higher rates for longer amounts of time, that's more economic pain that people will feel. More pain companies will feel, more pain commercial real estate will feel. It will, it's something we'll adjust to as an economy, but it does provide some questions.
And will more banks need bailouts?
Well, more banks need bailouts. So that's an interesting question. So we had, obviously, the collapse of the banks that we saw in March of last year, driven, of course, by poor risk management decisions on their behalf, but also the size of them. In aggregate, they had as many assets as all the banks that failed in 2008. However, it was contained when the Fed, opened the bank lending program that allowed a lot of banks to sort of reach a more equitable, greater equilibrium and not suffer a run on the banks like we saw in previous issues. This time, though, banks are still a little bit in trouble. One thing that I'm concerned about in particular is commercial real estate. We know this market's adapting, but commercial real estate exposure has shifted from big banks to smaller banks. Smaller banks in particular are vulnerable, and they maintain about 70% of commercial real estate ownership across the country. In many cases, they are vulnerable to these swings that we've seen in office space and industrial space and other space that hasn't necessarily returned back to where it was pre-pandemic. So a lot of commercial real estate provide questions, and we have about 300 or so billion dollars that are coming due this year for commercial real estate. I don't think it's in a catastrophic position for most banks, but it's something that we have to watch. So one of those things. Aaron,
Earlier this month, we got a New York Community Bank needing a $1 billion bailout. I don't know if that's a large number. It's large to me. But
we're going to see some of that. Yes. Oh, yes.
Is that a sign of more to come, or is it an anomaly, or?
It is. No, it's not an anomaly by any means. I think a lot of small banks in general, or the New York Community Bank, things like this, you're looking at a situation where some banks are more vulnerable than others. Large banks will be okay. Interestingly, I think they have deep capital resources and a whole bunch of assets. This isn't a real estate crisis in 2008 where every bank was owning things they didn't understand. But this is something where we do have some specific real estate crisis. And frankly, commercial lending is a problem in large swaths of the economy. And a lot of it, to Aaron's point, is garbage that, we'd have to figure out a way to either deal with or improve in some way. And so what do you do with all this? So what do you do when you have banks in this situation? Well, it depends. So right now, if it's a casual bank, look for the individual bailouts, individual situations that happen with banks. When 2008 happened, when we had a whole bunch of banks fail, the government instituted the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. And what that did was it said, the government became an owner of preferred stock in these banks. And then most banks actually paid them back. The whole bailout actually, when we net the whole thing, it was almost square, except for a little bit more money was made actually by the government. So it was a successful program in stabilizing the banks. I suspect the government would have to consider that if it became more widespread, but we're playing the wait and see game right now, Colin. And that's the question. So we don't know if it will be a minor problem with a few random banks that we'll continue to see, or whether it will continue to increase. And a lot of that question depends on if rates remain higher over the long run. Because a lot of banks are saying, if it only lasts until rates drop a little bit, we'll be okay. And a lot of responses that banks have done is that they've had these really low interest rate loans on these CREs, commercial real estate loans. And then they said, oh, we'll give you a 1-year extension to keep that rate low, even though we can't really afford it. We can afford it for 1 year, but then that year ticks up, and if rates are still high and they have to refinance them, then that starts some functional restructuring that will happen. So I'm worried about it. I'm mildly worried about it. Like, not enough to keep me up all night, but definitely at 3 a.m. when I'm going over the day-to-day words I said and how to reevaluate my life. It appears in there like a
So
ghost.
to kind of summarize what I think I just learned, inflation is rising, which means the Fed won't lower rates as fast as we want, which means the smaller banks are going to suffer a bit longer. Is that correct?
Yeah, smaller banks are suffering and they'll continue to suffer as long as rates remain high and they have a lot of CRE that need to come up. So what makes it different? And that's a good point, Colin, too. And I want to make this distinction as well. So when you buy a house, you buy an amortizing mortgage, right? Most of the time, not your interest only, hopefully. Most of the time, you're all buying these amortizing mortgages. Your payment is the same, but you're paying down the principal as you do it. Most CRE are interest only loans, right? So it's a 10-year interest-only loan, a 5-year interest-only loan, a 20-year interest-only loan. But what happens is eventually when 10 years is up, you get renewed by the bank for another 10 years, unless you are somehow cash flow rich and you can pay off the loan in its entirety. And so interest rates have a big effect on these type of loans in particular, because of the nature of how they make money. Aaron says, remember FDIC steps into dozens of hundreds of local banks every year to clean up shop and flip them into larger banks. TARP is the daddy to SERP. SERP is the uncle to Silicon. I love the family tree you're making of bank failures and their remedies, Aaron. Andrew says 19.6% of office space. Yes, in major US cities wasn't leased as of the fourth quarter and 25% in San Francisco, as it turns out, according to Moody's. Slightly above previous records of 19% and the highest number since 79. Absolutely true. Sean says, when I was in private equity, we did CRE loans all the time. That's Sean's voice. They were very lucrative. Aaron says, we have 10 times too many small banks, credit unions. Most should consolidate into state and multi-state regional banks. I love the Aaron point of view. Why aren't you just one big bank, says Aaron. We've got Germany and Japan have a very consolidated banking system. We don't need tons of them. But that's an interesting question. Do we need thousands of banks? Thanks for the voiceover, says Sean. But I appreciate that. So back to this. That's a good question. So that's all good. But I think to your point, Aaron, that's absolutely an interesting point that we're going to have. I think consolidation in the banking industry is the name of the game. I think we're going to see more consolidation. Because one issue is if you're in trouble as a bank, you can either go under or get bailed out. More likely you'll find a buyer and find somebody else to buy your good loans from you who can maintain and encourage your capital supply. Now, let's talk about debt a little bit. We've got 1.1 trillion of credit card debt, and we've seen fourth quarter auto loan delinquencies rise to the highest level that we've seen since 2010. Where are credit card delinquency rates the worst? Start in California, but head east. So Arizona's higher than California, New Mexico higher than Arizona, Texas, 25% of credit card trade lines are delinquent, 39% in Mississippi. It all kind of centers on Mississippi, really. It's like a circle, like a bullseye of credit card debt, where outlying areas have lower percentages of default risk. Default risk is rising. This is always the way to look at this. Is that the economy right now, although strong, is weakening, and a way that shows me it's weakening is the fact we see decreases in the quality of consumer credit. Likewise, we have some positive for potential buyers information involving listings. Price drops as it pertains to listings. The 4-week rolling average share of homes for sale with price drops are now increasing at the highest rate we've seen in years and earlier than we typically seen them. This does bode well for the unaffordable real estate market. Finally, right now, looking at a few things, and of course, you saw the news in the last week of the National Association of Realtors. These 6% costs that sellers have to pay most often, when it comes to selling their house to different brokers is now out the window. We're going to see a lot of real estate realtors compete on price now. These listings, the amount that sellers have to pay to have their home sold will go down. And as a consequence, this will help result and help have a feedback loop where hopefully more inventory will be available and some of the price pressure will start coming off on mortgages. But mortgage rates remain uncomfortably high and unaffordable in a lot of places. So what do we do about these shenanigans? Well, first is that we can build more. If we build more things in general, you pay less for them. And if we grab the data here, and this is a bunch of data downloaded that looks at new housing units authorized for regions, divisions, and states, where we see Texas and Florida having the two highest amounts of housing units issued, California coming in a rather dismal third for the most populous state in the country. But what's interesting about this too is that the number of structures with 5 units or more, so larger apartment structures, larger units, we see that they are more common in states like Texas, Florida, and even New Jersey per capita than they are in California. And the units per structure, the structures with 5 units or more are typically smaller in size. So only about 23 units on average in California than they are in Texas or Florida. Big deal is, what does this mean for real estate prices? So when you build things, even apartments, even luxury apartments, because of the way that the real estate is connected, if you build a bunch of luxury apartments in a city, luxury people who are occupying spaces where medium income people should live move to the luxury apartments, freeing up more real estate, of course, for medium income people to buy. And this has been true for a number of papers that have come out in the last few years. But we've seen that drops. The areas that have built the most have often dropped the most in prices. Year-on-year rent changes across the board for Florida, Texas, Arizona, Utah, North Carolina. Optimistic. So what does this mean for California? Planning regulations. This is from the Financial Times. So Texas is a bit less strict about their planning regulations than California. But if we look at the new dwelling approvals per 1,000 people, so based on the population of the individual city, look down here at San Francisco in blue. I like how it was featured recently in such a poor light. New dwelling approvals across the board. Texas cities all dwarf California cities. And as a consequence, the change in real house prices, Texas cities went up, but not nearly to the level that we saw in California cities increase in price. Building more does improve your ability to provide housing at a reasonable cost. So is this something we have to worry about too? And in general, the answer is no. One good part about the United States right now is most of the household debt we have are mortgages, and they're mortgages that are fixed and they have very low interest rates. Where we see vulnerability are we still have large segments of the world that use adjustable rate mortgages and house with high amounts of household debt. So one place where the United States looks like a sunshiny rainbow unicorn is right here on the housing market with relative to other developed countries. Norway in particular, incredibly high amount. Every mortgage is adjustable. Household debt is absurdly high. Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Australia, Finland, much more vulnerable to house price crashes and more severe issues than we are at this moment. Interesting news. So we had a question here. So one thing Colin asked me to talk about today a little bit was trends in corporate profits in general. Yeah, the best part about Norway, all these countries have a better social safety net than we do. All of them do. Trends in corporate profits. How do these affect job seekers? So first of all, does corporate profit margins coming down affect the job seeker? This is an observation that if we look at aggregate profits, the total profits of all the corporations, and now about $3 trillion more or less, they've been pretty flat since about 2021 or so. So the last 3 years, corporate profits in general have not increased in aggregate. In fact, they've been rather disappointing in how they behave. But they remain significantly higher than where they were even 20 years ago. And if we think about a trend line, I mean, they remain quite good. So overall, more profitable companies are in better positions to hire, but they don't always use their money to hire. Corporations have a choice. One of the easiest and most fundamental ways to look at this, when a company makes a profit, it is 2 things that they can do with it. They can give you dividends as the investor, and you say, oh goodness, I get cash. Or they can reinvest it in themselves. We've also seen corporations, of course, embark upon stock buybacks, where they spend a lot of money buying back their own stock, often by taking out debt to do so. This doesn't increase their stock price as much as they think it will. It's been the jig has been up since the 90s on that one. Doesn't have a huge effect on stock prices, but it is a thing that happens. So what happens? Did corporate profits, did this affect inflation or not? And if corporate profits fall disproportionately to a few upsurge years, how does that affect the stock market? And will it affect venture capitalism? So first of all, inflation went up, of course, because we had supply chains broken down, an injection of 5 trillion in capital. Corporate profits, of course, some sectors of the economy, more than others, it was a factor in some parts, but not a dominant factor. There are many factors at play for inflation, but the two big ones were, of course, supply chains breaking down and the amount of money slushing around the system, I should say. But if corporate profits fall into a few upsurge years, does that affect the stock market at large? You know, it's a good question. One way we can look at stock market valuation is looking at something called the PE ratio, which is, of course, the price to earnings ratio. And one of the ways that we can do that, and let's see if I can, I'll share, let me grab a quick screenshot of this real quick. So the price to earnings ratio basically tells you what the price of the stock is over how much the money the company actually makes. The idea being is if a company is, all hat, no cattle, if it's an impressive company, but it produces no money and it has a really high stock price, the PE ratio will be really high. It might be overvalued. On the other hand, if we have a company that is making tons of money, but its stock price is low, it looks like a value company, a bargain company. And what we found over time is, and a lot of financial research is, companies with low PE ratios outperform companies with high PE ratios in the long run. So sometimes that can happen. But here's the thing. This is the overall S&P 500. Right now, the price to earnings ratio is the price to how much over how much the companies are actually making. Right now, it is one of the highest levels we've ever seen. And so when we think about the stock market in general, while it does appear overvalued in aggregate, one of two things has to happen. The market has to go down in the long run, or profits have to come up substantially in the next few years. And that would be driven by a Fed who lowered rates, increased profitability in ways that the market has not yet even accounted for. And so it is up to you to decide what fate is in store for us. But this is probably, don't linger long at this level, particularly with interest rates that are high. If interest rates remain higher for longer, I'd expect the market to take more hits. Interesting stuff. Yeah, the PE ratio in the Great Depression, Andrew, absolutely right. Some of the lowest on record, even during the 1980s. The thing is, when interest rates are really high, nobody wants to invest in the stock market because they can make money in bonds and other things that have lower risk. And so even in the 80s, when interest rates were 14%, et cetera, in the United States, we had a very undervalued stock market. And then when interest rates dropped through the 80s and 90s, that was like super fuel for the stock market. And it shot up. 2000, we had the highest level of price to earnings on record in the tech bubble, where we had a lot of new companies that didn't make any money, and that crash had sent us back down to level. And it's interesting that even though we had these very low interest rates over a long period of time, these 0% rates, and rates have risen, we're still very much, this is a PE ratio of a low interest rate economy, not a medium interest rate economy or a high interest rate economy. And that's fascinating. Berkshire Hathaway's P ratio is only 10. I own a share of Berkshire Hathaway, or a few shares, or 100 shares, something, I don't know. I own some non-shares of Berkshire Hathaway, but it's good. I own a little bit of Berkshire Hathaway, and I get to watch those meetings all the time. And it's been really good in the portfolio. Although I'm not endorsing that specifically, but it's been a good investment. Oh man, yes, Sean, we have to fire Sean. Sean works for Berkshire Hathaway. Sorry, Sean, gotta let you go. Need layoffs. I'm gonna write a kindly worded letter to Warren. Interest rates and the wealth gap. So here's another audience question for you. Why does Janet Yellen and Jerome Powell insist on keeping interest rates high, but it's only hurting the working class and not easing inflation? The rich are not slowing their spending. So the premise of this was actually looked at by the Board of Governors, a researcher named Daniel Ringo, in a paper called Monetary Policy and Home Buying Inequality. And they found that when you raise interest rates, it indeed adversely affects people who are low income much more than it affects people who are high income. So as a consequence, you have got a lot of this right now where interest rates are hurting people who need that day-to-day, those day-to-day loans that are tied to it, automotive loans, house loans, in ways that the rich folks don't have to deal with. And this is a really interesting question. And you're absolutely right, of course, the disproportionate effects are very much there. Now, this is hard because the issue with economists in general, and in finance, we are victims of the same thing. We see the economy through the lens of aggregates, aggregate spending, aggregate increases, aggregate decreases. And what drives a lot of these spending are, of course, richer individuals. And although richer individuals own a lot of properties, and they might own a lot of different things, and if they chose to finance those different things, they'll see in aggregate a high amount of increase as well from all of the different investments that they might invest in when interest rates are high. But to people who are looking at a single car, looking to buy, take out loans to maintain a house or maintain some other necessary consumer item or even college education, it comes down and disproportionately affects poor folks. And that remains an issue, and it is going to be a continued issue. It does hurt the working class more than the wealthier class, which is why we're seeing part of the split between the philosophies of where we should send the economy right now, whether we should cut early and enable these people to be in a better fiscal position, or whether we should, sort of strangle the inflation out of the economy for a bit longer. And in essence, Jerome Powell will look at this and he'll say, the danger of inflation is greater than the danger of extra costs for the average individual. And that's the thesis behind it. And this is really interesting. Good points here. Sean says, executives may use share buybacks to inflate stock metrics. Absolutely true. That's the agency problem. I wrote my PhD thesis was on agency-related issues. Aaron says MMT economics is absurd. Interest rates lower inflation. How could somebody get a paper published that claims rates don't lower inflation? That's also true. Interest rates lower. That is true. I'm interested in what they said about that. MMT economics is kind of absurd. Not a huge fan of it, but it does hit people differently. But in this case, the issue that we're looking at here is basically that Jerome Powell sees inflation as a much greater issue for an average person than interest rates are. And that's why he wants to crush it. Yeah, yacht taxes. Just crush the boat building industry, Aaron. Years of yacht taxes. Ruined Aaron. That's why he's on this list. So the climate change economy, stuff to think about too. So we had a question about when is climate change effects going to happen? Well, in some ways they're here. We're seeing higher premiums for property and casualty insurance. When you have, if you look at climate change as being a harbinger of greater natural disasters, that causes greater damage and storms in other places, and it causes all these other issues, which of course boosts the amount that insurance providers charge you for things like insurance. And we've seen notable jumps in insurance across the board. Homeowners insurance have increased. Automotive insurance, motor vehicle insurance, reckless driving, among other things. We're seeing double-digit price increases now in insurance premiums for the last couple of years in ways that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And when you think about the Wall Street Journal posted this graphic, severe weather events and insurance industry losses for the first half of the year from 2010 to 2023. A lot of these insurance premiums are rising because losses are really high. It's very expensive to rebuild. It's very expensive infrastructure costs in this country. And so as a consequence, that results in higher premiums. So that's where you see a lot of the climate change issues as it pertains to a lot of this. Look at this. Colin, be rich, want yachts, can afford 500 yachts, see a 20% tax. I'm not going to buy one. Oh, man. Look at this. You guys are really into the boat situation right now. You guys have a bunch of boat suits just sitting on your boat in Sausalito right now, logging on. What are you going to do with that? Ski club's $150 a year to use cabins for $20 a day. Oh God, you guys and your boat clubs. We have them. I can try it, and we have an arroyo out back that I can try to boat in. I keep trying to sail it, but no dice. Other things to think about, though, floods have become less deadly, which is good, although they cost a lot of other things. Global flood fatalities, on a positive note, have become less deadly in part due to better urban planning, better warnings around flood-related issues. I also was asked to talk about 0% reserve requirements. Prior to 2020, reserve requirements were a standard tool in monetary policy, and they used to control the amount of cash banks hold relative to deposit liabilities. When we shifted to a 0% reserve requirement for banks, that was unprecedented and it had some positive effects. It moved more money aside for banks to invest in other things. And what that does is it stimulates the market by making a lot of businesses receive loans, they hire more people, and you get this positive feedback loop in the economy. For individuals, that's greater access to credit, interest rates on deposits and loans, and overall economic health. And if the Fed were to say get back or push back a little bit on this, and we end up with a greater than 0% reserve requirement or a higher reserve requirement, this would help reduce a lot of those things. And this remains a monetary policy tool that can be a play for a lot of people here. Albert says, you get a boat off Facebook Marketplace for $10,000, but it's the slip fees that'll kill you. Maybe I'll park it somewhere. Nobody expects a boat. What's the most navigable inland waterway in California? Can I buy a boat and put it somewhere in the, how far it's in the Central Valley can I go with that thing? I just put it in. Somebody's got to have a cheap thing. I'll park it in some, orchard somewhere. Sean was in Sausalito on Sunday watching other people in their boats. Sean was watching Aaron in his boat. What a magnificent change. Port, New Mexico, the Sea of New Mexico. Tahoe. That's right. So when we think about this, reserve requirements are also a monetary policy tool that can be used. Thank you, by the way, for everybody who's still sticking around, still trying to answer all these questions. I appreciate you and your patience looking at this. So one of the things, actually, let me go over a few of the other questions I might have missed up to this point a little quickly on this too. So we had some questions about, one person asked, should I leave and return to tech? Can you return to tech later? And transitioning away from tech does carry risks, no doubt. But it can also offer the option for building a diverse array of experiences that will actually benefit your career opportunities down the line. Returning may require, staying updated with industry trends and skills. But I mean, the tech sector is so vast, so interesting, and having experience in here and also in some other sector can be beneficial, but you might not end up exactly where you started. You might have a completely different job, but it can still be useful. I could almost look at any tech experience, even in other capacities in other industries, as being positive. And likewise, people do return to it over time, especially when you want to join your boat club. Oh, we got Lori says, boat club member here too. Just use it for the day, pay my gas and let them maintain it. Man, I'm in the wrong, but New Mexico Boat Club. I'm in the wrong place. Good job, guys, in your boat clubs. Albert's list has gotten very bougie these days, and I appreciate this. I love you guys in your boats. This is great. I too would have a boat if I lived, more coastal. But one of the things, we also had a question about automation, robotics, and employment. I mean, again, we kind of addressed that earlier. Education, reskilling, policy interventions focused on job creation in new sectors. This stuff would be critical in the long run. Economic indicators. So individual experiences will always vary, even if the economy is doing well. It doesn't mean that your experience with the economy is itself wrong, because you feel the economy to you has been badly, and it's often not personal, where you have opportunities in sectors. We can have a brilliant economy, but we can also struggle in certain sectors. Oh yeah, so that's good. So that was a couple of the big things here. Now, good long-term trends to think about to kind of close off a little bit of this. Income distribution has gotten more equal in the last 30 years. The global income inequality with the rise of Asia has actually dropped significantly in the last 30 years. That's positive news. We're always talking about negative news here, and I want to kind of end on a positive note, give you hope for the future. It's not all grim prognostications about the future. The US dollar remains the world's reserve currency. We talked about that before. Look at that dollar demand, just full of just filling the global exchange reserves right now with its ancient Bretton Woods infused glory from 1944 as a reserve currency. And for those of you interested in this, lightning rate fatalities, they've reached a steady low over the last 50 years. So all those people on their boats taking them out, low lightning fatalities across the country. This is mainly due to fewer people working in agriculture. Other good long-term trends, poverty has declined significantly across the globe. Multilateral trade liberalization has been good for this. Foreign direct investment in U.S. manufacturing remains near record highs, actually. And we saw some of that benefit in the last few years as well. So all of this stuff bodes well for the economy. There's good things to look at. And then you go to the San Francisco breakdown, and it's a little bit more disappointing. It was the biggest jump in both San Francisco's unemployment rate between December to January in San Jose's unemployment rate from December to January that we've seen here on Albert's list over the last 2 years I've been doing these shenanigans. So the unemployment rate in the Bay Area rose from 4 to 4.5% in January. You had 20,000 people fewer in the labor force, and you had an additional 12,000 unemployed people in San Francisco, an additional 5,000 in San Jose. Those are substantial numbers. Where were they located? What was the nature of this? How did it fall? And we saw some pushbacks in a few sectors that were really interesting. Professional and business services, as noted, 8,000 drop from December to January. Leisure and hospitality, 5,000 drop. And impressively, a catastrophic 10,000 drop in the amount of people employed in trade, transportation, and utilities. So as trade, transportation, utilities, incredibly high demand. As the economy bounced back and supply chains were fixed, we're seeing some attrition there. Meanwhile, in San Jose, kind of a couple of the things that were the same. Trade, transportation, utilities dropped another 4,000. You also saw 2,000 fewer in professional business services, 3,000 fewer in education and health services. So this is substantial. This is a sign of an economy that, especially in the Bay Area, is weakening very significantly. And what you're feeling is true. Normally, the Bay Area has a lower unemployment rate than the rest of the country. It has since now gotten the other way around. So what a fascinating issue. Will this affect your boat club experiences over the next 5 years? This has been the most boat dialogue. I had a boat once.
We've done this for about 2 years now. This is the most boat dialogue ever.
It's the highest. We have a new record for boat club. Also, it's only $250 a year for boat club. That seems impressive. Maybe I should just join a San Francisco boat club.
Yeah.
I'm missing out, apparently.
Yeah,
have a
you could. How much is a flight from Albuquerque to SFO? I mean, right? You could
We got
probably.
direct flights these days, you know, it depends. I usually travel by mule carriage or mule train, but we'll see. Hold on. It's enough.
I have a question about the dollar reserve. So we know BRICS exists, and they've complained about this US dollar hegemony or whatever they call it. What would be a warning sign that the US dollar is losing its status as a reserve currency?
Oh, yeah. So people start losing it, using it less. So I'd be looking at these trends, and indeed they are doing a little bit, right? So we look at right now, although it's a reserve currency, you know, it's gone down from, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of transactions that were transacted involved the dollar in 1999. That's down to 59% of transactions. You would see this number drop off. Things that would remain, a bunch of poor trade decisions, economic issues in our country driven by, say, geopolitical concerns, other things that would drive us downward would do it. And I suspect over the long run, it will happen. It's just been very robust that it hasn't done so yet.
Okay.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
It's gonna happen.
But it's going to happen, and it could be 100 years, it could be 10 years, depending on the acceleration of our, because I mean, it's a fact, but think of it. So it's 1944. It's Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The United States and all the allies met in this hotel. The US locked the doors and said, guess what? We're the only country that's going to make it out of World War II unscathed. The modern monetary system will be based off of us. Our currency became the only currency convertible to gold, and the rest of the currencies had to hold dollars to convert to gold. And from 1944 to 1973, that was the global case. And we have since benefited heroically from this, which is why that because of this, you know, largesse, we're actually going to be able to be in a, despite no matter how much we'll mess up as a country, we have to mess up catastrophically to reduce this privilege to a level that it no longer works for us anymore. Which, who knows, we might just do, because we can do anything, right? Because this is America. And if no one messes up like that.
Do the federal rates impact this at all?
Do the federal rates impact? This is interesting. So localized cash flows. So investor cash flows do go up and down with rates. And I'll give you an example of this. When rates go up, you know, if you're an investor parking global amounts of money somewhere and you want to generate a positive rate of return, higher interest rates often allow you to park your money in a place. So people will move funds around globally where they'll get the best interest rate. But to that point, it also affects exchange rates and other things. So there ends up being some variation there in where people actually end up putting their money and how much of an effect that has. Long story short is that the Federal Reserve rates haven't impacted this directly significantly. What does direct it, though, is the United States' perception as a store of value and our perception as the dollar being so more, it's even less that the dollar itself is appealing and more that the dollar is more appealing relative to some of its competitor currencies. Either because it's free floating, it lacks, the direct government control or partial government control of the Chinese yuan, renminbi, and it doesn't have the same level of, our economic situation isn't as bad as the euro area, and so collectively that combination of factors does make the dollar desirable. The greenback is perceived as stable. Sean, nail on the head, exactly right. Perception's everything in finance, and we're just the luckiest country on earth sometimes, and this is one of those days. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. That's extremely informative.
What else do you have? Did I miss anything? Questions anybody has from the audience? Anything you want to go over? Thank you for those of you who stuck around. Amazed to see you guys all here. You've asked such wonderful questions. I hope you got some ideas for joining a local boat club. You can run into everybody there.
I mean, right, with all the credit card debt that we're running up as a country, what's another boat, right? Yeah. So okay, we're looking at this last month's data, or rather January data for the Bay Area, and it doesn't look pretty. What do you predict you will see for the February version when we get that? And then I think, given everything you just mentioned and where the market has been, what's your insight and advice for job seekers? I field a ton of questions every single time about what people should do as a job seeker. And I know you're not a job search expert, but you are an economist and you do understand incentives and everything. So how do we incentivize the job seeker at this point?
So first of all, don't lose hope. So first, projections over the job market. The Bay Area, it isn't out of the tech, you aren't out of the tech issues yet. And I think given the sort of situation of the economy here, California as a whole, and I know we have some people from LA dialing in.
And beyond.
There's a lot California can do to become a more, dynamic place for businesses to do business. And that's some of it. And a lot of that depends on decisions that Californians make regarding where they want their state to go in certain aspects. And certainly the trade-off between, business and development growth versus, keeping things stable and keeping things the same.
So you're saying there's an election this year and California.
I'm saying there's an election this year, but it depends, but it's not a clear answer. Not like party A or party B. It's a matter of, because if you talk to people, for instance, like, although I can sit on a high horse and say, well, I think you should, do as you've continued to do and make, keep liberalizing building regulations, improve it, make it easier to build stuff in California. That is opposed by a lot of people on both the right and the left for different reasons. And so it's, I view it as a non-political statement. For job seekers in general, though, first, don't give up hope. Concentrate in your downtime. If you find yourself unemployed and looking for work, consider sectors outside of your primary sector. Please do so. A lot of people are pigeonholed. I have students who have done this before, and when they've expanded their mindset slightly, either their location or industry, and expanded their capability of what they believe they can do, they often find work. Retool everything. Look at that cover letter. I'm a big fan of cover letters. Tell a story in your cover letter of you as a human being and how you got there. That will distinguish you from 100 other resumes in this pack for the half of people that actually vote for this. Big fan of doing that.
Will you read a ChatGPT authored cover letter?
Right. Yes. ChatGPT, tell me about my life, ChatGPT. Yes. Tell me, weave me a tale. We'll find that out quickly. Don't do that, but also focus on something that's personal, and it's okay to show the vulnerability that led you in the position that you are now. You've got a great story. Own it, be part of it, tell that story to someone else, and answer affirmatively and confidently why you're the best person for this job. Right across the board, though, it's going to be an interesting year for San Francisco and San Jose. I don't expect we'll see unemployment rise significantly higher. Hold on, wait, this just came through. Let me
Yeah, because you had mentioned the growing industries, right? Michael calls back to it here. And obviously, right, healthcare is up. Uh,
Yes.
oh my goodness. We're doing our next webinar on that yacht.
Yeah, this is Albert's List headquarters. This is what Albert does on his day to day.
Where I survey the job market from the top deck.
That's from the top deck of the portfolio.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that I think if you go back up to that slide where you were talking about the industries that continue to grow, you had mentioned, getting into a government job, probably healthcare. I don't know
Yes.
how many people on this webinar want to go work at a drinking or eating establishment, but I guess maybe you could go to a nice French restaurant.
So that's true. But okay, but let's say you have tech skills that
Yeah.
is marketable across the board in any industry that you go to. And I mean that genuinely. And okay, so maybe you're a
I
software
hear
engineer.
boat clubs are hiring.
Right. And the thing is, you're looking at, but really, let's talk here. So, I mean, the people that'll be more nuanced, right? That specialized work, you've been working as a software engineer doing a particular type of thing for a long period of time, or another type of thing. You're going to have an issue with certainly that same standard of living in different aspects, but you do have opportunities. And you do have a lot of places that you can extend in, a lot of places that you can actually apply to work. Do it because it will be good. I think if you bear through, if you can last long enough in the area to see the Fed start lowering rates, if the Fed lowers rates, that will put more energy into tech hiring, and that will happen next year, this year, some point, not too soon in the future. So
Yeah. Yeah.
this boat club.
That's good. So I think that's really great insight there. And we appreciate it every single month because there are so many different news points and numbers that come through every single day. And we're closely watching what Jerome Powell says on Capitol Hill this week as well in his very coded Fed speak language. So if you enjoyed watching this, I just dropped a link for those of you who are watching live into the webinar chat to RSVP for next month. You get the same amount of humor. Who knows what tangential topic we'll speak about then? And you get the same amount of insight, if not more, especially if something out of the ordinary does happen. So come join us again next month with your questions, with your insights, with your concerns, especially if there are more layoffs and all points in between. We appreciate you joining us this evening. And thank you again, Dr. White. And we'll see you again all next month.
Thank you
Have a
for
good
having
evening,
me, guys.
everybody.
I appreciate all your questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you all soon. Bye.